This video contains spoilers for the end of Expedition 33, as well as events at the Flying Manor. A painting within a painting. This concept is first introduced to us through some dialogue that occurs at the campfire, specifically between Verso and Lune, after it's been introduced to us that Mael herself is also a paintress. Naturally, with the curiosity that Lune's character has been shown to have, she seems to want to know more about the world that Mael came from. However, we are told that painted individuals cannot go backwards. They can't go to the world that their creators are from. It would seem that there is this idea of painting inception, that Mael could evidently create a painting that reflects her own world and allow Lune to learn about it through that.
Since we mere mortals can't leave this canvas, Mael has kindly offered to paint the outside world for me. A painting inside this painting.
While this just seems like somewhat of a throwaway line, and it even seems very pertinent to Lune's character, somebody who seeks knowledge and who seems to constantly want to discover more about their world, it can just seem like something that furthers her development and also just showcases her individuality. However, it definitely got my interest piqued. The idea that there is a concept of a painting within a painting made me wonder if the world that Mael came from is in fact not the real world. I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this concept, and I'm going to start with a theory that seems relatively feasible, and then I want to get into something that seems especially out there, but the more that I was kind of doing research into this other theory I had, the more excited I became about it. If you yourself have anything to add to this concept, feel free to elaborate in the comments down below, but I wanted to walk through together the one that seems relatively feasible, as well as the one that might be a little far-fetched, but I think is really fun. I've also been curious if the painted individuals could essentially learn how to manipulate chroma so that they themselves could start to paint, and I wasn't sure about this. In fact, I thought that maybe everything led to the direction that no, it's not possible until we get to the Flying Manor. You eventually get to a cutscene where you have the painted Clea revealed, and it would seem that she herself is continuing to produce Nevrons. We know that Clea produced Nevrons so as to prevent the chroma from people who had died going back to her mother, because she was trying to aid her father in stopping her mother and getting her out of the painting. That said, she is just somebody who is consistently over and over and over again making Nevrons and making some of the most powerful Nevrons, but at the very least, you do see the characters identifying what painted Clea is doing, which is she herself is painting.
What happened to her?
I bet Claire hated Maman's portrait of her, so she painted over her.
And now she paints Nevrons.
Once this idea came to mind, the idea that somebody within a created world, or potentially a fictional world depending on how we're viewing it, the idea that somebody who is created for this fake place through some kind of art form, the idea that they could then use whatever thing it was that created their world in the first place. Once this came to mind, it sort of opened the doors for there to be layers and layers and layers of inception happening, which is what then made me wonder if the world that Mael or Alicia came from, Verso, Clea, and the entire family, is that world itself real? Initially, it looks to be more aligned with our own world, and it's a historical fiction setting, although slightly alternate because of the fact that obviously they are making worlds through art. Not only that, but it seems that painters are not the only forms of individuals who are essentially godlike and create these worlds. We see this mysterious group known as the Riders, who seem to have played some kind of role in the fire that ended up harming Mael and killing Verso. First thought upon hearing this was that the Riders and the painters were both almost like guilds within the world, but then I questioned if it was the writers and the painters both being inside this world, or if the writers are to Alicia as the paintress is to everybody in Lumiere. This is the part of the theory that I think is actually a decent one, and that I'm sure I'm not the only person to have put these things together and come up with this concept. I think a lot of people have questioned whether the world that I'm going to call Clea's world, because this is the world where it seems like she has her fight, I definitely think I'm not alone in wondering if this place is real. Another indication that this is some form of fictional, aside from the very literal, obviously this is a video game that we're all playing, but the idea that it is somewhat fictional also has some evidence when it comes to the ending that most of us are referring to as Verso's ending. And within this, if you actually zoom in at Verso's grave, the date for his death doesn't seem like a real date that we would use in our own world. There's some evidence that perhaps there was a different kind of calendar used around this time, but it still doesn't line up exactly with the dates. So I think that that's another tick in the column, that there's something a little bit different about this world. We also know that time within the Lumiere world that we spend most of our time within, time does not work the same way within that world. So if that's true of Lumiere, then Clea's world, it's possible that time also doesn't work exactly the same, which perhaps could indicate a different use of days for the calendar. There are some additional fun, interesting implications of this, and also I think things that lead to the ideas of sequels. The idea that anybody could essentially utilize chroma or other kinds of power to then manipulate art and create new worlds opens the doors for all sorts of sequels. Surely a lot of us, I think, have liked the idea of there being something to do with the writers and the painters within Clea's world, and then I think some of us are just happy to see other paintings and other amazing fantasy worlds. There's just so many things that they could do with it, but there is a way that you could start to tie in, if you wanted, some of the characters that we have, or maybe in future installments, if you go back far enough and you find enough Easter eggs and item descriptions, it's actually revealed that Lune, if we do see that the Mael ending is actually canon, maybe Lune figured out how to become a paintress herself, and then maybe she created her own world. I also think it's very interesting that Lune is shown to be somebody who is a musician. A lot of us definitely consider painting to be art, but I think art can be captured within so many different forms of storytelling. For example, we have the writers themselves. We don't really fully understand their powers, but the idea of writing as an art form, I think, is something a lot of people are on board with. Also, though, it is, I would say, nearly undebatable that music is an art form, and not only do we know that Lune performs music and she plays it, but we do have a scene where she writes music as well. So there is the idea of her writing. She has a paintress that is guiding her potentially through Mael, and then she also already has experience not just in science and research, but also music. It seems like the perfect recipe for Lune herself to become somebody who creates worlds. Or at the very least, maybe we can fill in the blanks if we really want to comfort ourselves after some of those darker endings and decide that Lune figured out a solution to the problem of Verso feeling trapped within Mael's ending, there being this soul fracture that is still within the painting, her figuring out a way to allow that individual to rest but to keep their world alive, and for Mael to somehow go back if she so chose, and the painting could exist without her input and her abilities. The developers of this game and the writers seem very intentional with the clues they leave behind. Specifically, you see the various logs indicating some events, and they allow for foreshadowing and for you to predict what's going on. Then the more information you have, the more not only those start to make sense, but then you're starting to get more reveals that indicate lore within the game. You also just in general have little hints along the way through dialogue, through characters' actions, and of course even through the way that they're animated, the expressions they make. So I don't really think that this was just thrown in there just for fun, nor do I think it was just there to show more of Lune's character. I think there was more intentionality behind introducing to us the idea of a painting within a painting. In the same way, though, that the idea of a painting within a painting further solidified for me that there is a chance of Clea's world being fictional as well. Similarly, the idea that they would have so many parallels between Lune and Verso, specifically with music, the writing of music, them both being interested in these art forms, and then them also having these parents that instilled in them the desire for research and to carry something on, it got me wondering a little bit further about Verso. This is where we're going to get really off the walls with a theory, but I have a suspicion that perhaps the Verso within Clea's world is also a fictional Verso. It's not just that the world is fictional, it's that he is, in the same way he is a painting, so he's a copy of the Verso within Clea's world. Perhaps he is also already, within Clea's world, a copy of a Verso that exists in the world that might have created Clea's world. That was a giant word salad, so I'm going to try to be a little bit clearer. For now, I'm going to refer to the three different areas as the writer's world, if we do think that perhaps the writers are to Clea's world what the paintress is to Mael's. So I'm going to refer to this one area as the writer's world, Clea's world, and then Lumiere, just for not only consistency's sake, but to make things a little bit easier to follow. Laying that groundwork then, the idea is that perhaps there is a Verso that exists within the writer's world, and that Verso himself was a writer. Obviously, Clea has some kind of opposition to the writers, as we have discussed, but we know that it's possible for characters to be in opposition to a group of beings with these powers, not realizing that those individuals might actually be their very family members. We also know that sometimes these individuals, like the painters and like the writers, they might not all see eye to eye. They might not all have the same idea of what they should do with their powers. Obviously, that's a huge point of contention within the Descendre family. You see that we have Renoir and Clea on one side, and then you have Aline and Alicia/Mael on the other, and then Verso's sort of caught in the middle of all of this. So it stands within reason that perhaps the writers are not all on the same page. If Verso himself is potentially a writer within a writer's world, then it's possible that he was trying to do things to help his own family within Clea's world. Because I know that this seems really far-fetched, I want to zero into what made me think further that this was a possibility and some of the evidence behind it. So first off, the very name Verso. Creators of this game have layers and layers and layers of symbolism, and they're constantly trying to clue you in with a lot of what they're doing. This is very true of Verso himself. Just the definition of Verso is referring to the backside of a painting, which makes perfect sense given that the Verso within the Lumiere world is a copy of the version of Verso that existed within Clea's world. So he is the reversed side. He is the other side. And I really love that concept, but that's not the only use of the word Verso. This is also referring to the backside of a page. Perhaps Verso himself wasn't a writer within some kind of writer's world. Maybe he was written into existence within Clea's world, however. So that definitely would make sense to the additional definition of Verso's name. However, there was another line of dialogue that made me kind of wonder a little bit further about Verso, and also just the idea that it seems as though these painted versions or these replicated versions seem to inadvertently start to take on some of the decision making, or at the very least motivations, of the version they were copied from. It seems like they can't help but start to have some of the memories of those characters instilled within them, and then they act upon those things. You actually see Mael do this, because initially Mael is just Mael. She's the version of herself that grew up in Lumiere, that had Gustave as a brother, and who seemed determined to defeat the paintress. And you also see her tell Verso, I know you're not my brother, but I also think you're a real person and I care about you. However, toward the end of the game, pretty much nearly the end of the game, she starts to talk to Verso as if it is her brother. I don't want to lose you. I just want to get back the time that we lost. And it starts to go against the Mael that we saw before. It seems very much like the Alicia side of her is taking over. Even before Mael realizes her paintress side, she ends up starting to recognize things as familiar. So it does seem like anytime there is some kind of copied version, that they start to exhibit signs of their previous self. This kind of clashes a little bit within Verso as well, because consistently I started to question, does he want to help the expedition, or does he want to end it all? And it seems like he constantly has actions that contradict themselves. And initially I thought, is this just not the strongest of writing? Is he just a character that is made up of contradictions? Or is it that there is something within him that is pushing him into a certain direction that goes against the version of him that exists within whatever world he's inside? So as an example, within Lumiere, you see within his logs, he actually argues for the ability to live. He thinks that all of the people within Lumiere deserve to live. And it can be argued that he just got tired after years of existence. That's relatively reasonable. However, it's just such a difference between where you see him end up and also within the events of the final act of the game. Even within that, he seems to go back and forth. As an example, when he hears from Renoir that there's a piece of Verso's soul that is within the painting, that's trapped within the painting, he seems to perk up at this idea. He also doesn't seem totally on board with the idea of Mael bringing everybody back. However, he's also the same person to remind her how to use chroma to bring some of her friends back. So you actually see him guiding her into how to bring Lune back, how to bring Ciel back, which seems to go against the idea of him being on Renoir's side. So then you wonder, was it just a game time decision at the very end when they're fighting Renoir and he opens up what is basically like a portal and he shows what's happening to Aline? And is it just that Verso in that moment suddenly decided, actually, this isn't worth it, which just seems like a very rash decision given that he is determining everybody's existence. It definitely seems to be one of those things where it's like, well, you need to decide, are you on her side or are you not on her side? But I think the idea that there are actually clashing motivations within Verso has a lot of merit to it, and potentially these clashing things within him are actually due to the fact that he was a copy from another version, which we know this to be true. This isn't anything that is a theory. We know this is literally true within Lumiere. He is a copy of the Verso that existed within Clea's world. And within that world, he tried desperately to save Mael. In fact, he succeeded in saving Mael. However, it is now eating him alive to know that in saving his sister, he has essentially destroyed the rest of his family because they are so caught up in the grief of his loss. It has made it a moot point. He might as well have not saved Mael because now Mael is killing herself just to have more time with him. His mother was killing herself. It was ruining the family. So it makes sense that there is that clash within him where the Verso of Lumiere wants desperately to have this world exist.
And once we free Mama, she'll bring you back. It won't be forever. I promise. I promise. We deserve to live. All of us. We deserve to exist.
However, there is also the version from Clea's world that wants to save Mael.
The moment I leave, Papa will erase this canvas.
This is not worth your life.
It's like there's these warring parts of him that have one take over at any given time. That said, this was obviously one of the last acts that Verso ever took part in within Clea's world, because saving Mael is what led to his death. So it seems a little interesting that that would be something that would essentially imprint itself onto his copied self so strongly. And also, Aline seems in denial about his death. And the version that she created, you would think, because of the fact that she seems to borderline blame Mael for what happened and seems angry at her child for this, you would think that she would not paint into him something that would be so strong. It seems like this is some kind of remnant within him that wasn't something that Aline perhaps could have predicted. So if we're returning to the idea that maybe perhaps he himself was a writer that existed in the writer's world, maybe the reason that he is so passionate about saving Mael is perhaps in the writer's world it was some version of what we see in Clea's and within Lumiere. However, perhaps there was a fire and Mael died within it, and he decided to write a version of existence where instead of Mael dying, he died. In the same way that Aline thought that creating this fictional version of her family within Lumiere could fix her problems and have a better reality, it's possible that there was a writer version of Verso that thought saving Mael was going to fix all of his family's problems. It was perhaps a cycle of grief that started with him, and by him trying to change everything, he created a version of his family that also was torn apart by grief. This time around, though, it was torn apart by grief at his death. And because of this, it actually had the reverse impact. It didn't make everything better for them. It actually led them to have the painting within a painting. It had them create a fictional world where now everybody's caught in the middle and they're actually destroying the lives of people in Lumiere. And thus, because painted Verso within Lumiere has some of the memories of potentially written Verso, it would make sense if the whole idea behind written Verso's character was to save Mael, then that would explain why he feels so strongly like he has to save her this time around, despite the fact that he, given his log, really believed that the people of Lumiere deserved to live. I also want to tie this into the ending that we see with Verso's ending specifically, because something about this ending rubbed me the wrong way a little bit, and I definitely don't consider it to be the good ending. I think a lot of people have come away deciding there is no such thing as a good ending within this game because there's just too much at stake, there's too much to lose, and a lot of it comes down to whether or not you think that the people of Lumiere were real or not, and that's what dictates which ending you think is better. But even if the Verso ending, if we disregard all of the philosophical debates about what it means to be alive, do the people of Lumiere have souls, or are they real people with real feelings and they have sentience? If we disregard all of that and we just look at the ending as a whole, it feels too dreamlike. It feels too perfect. If you have this idea that there is a Verso who is somehow looking upon this, then this would be the perfect conclusion because now his family is happy. Oh, look, Aline and Renoir are suddenly snuggling, basically, and holding hands, even though we've been shown time and time again that there was a lot of animosity between the two of them. They did not have a happy marriage, but apparently just his death was enough to bring them together. The acceptance of his death was enough to bring them together. And Clea is going to keep doing her own thing. It also would kind of make sense if Clea is a little bit at war with the writers, that we would see her as somebody who's a little indifferent and borderline irritated at the way that the rest of the family is behaving. Then you have Mael, who seems borderline angelic and just so happy. She's accepted that Verso is gone and he's dead for real now, and he gets to be at rest, and then all her friends are waving at her, and it's so corny and cheesy, and it doesn't seem like Mael at all. It definitely does not seem like how Mael would handle this situation, because chances are Mael's not going to have accepted Verso's death very quickly, and it does not look like she's aged really since the ending, since we saw her say goodbye to Verso against her will. I think it would take her a little bit longer to accept his death. It would take a little bit longer for the family to all come together in this dreamlike state. And I don't think she would view her friends as just happily waving at her. I think it would haunt her because she wanted to exist within that world. So if she already was devastated at the idea of not having Verso anymore, she's likely going to be devastated that everybody and everything that she had known for the part of her that is Mael, all of them are gone. I don't think she would see them as waving cheerily to her. Instead, this seems more of like the perfect outcome for Verso, except for Verso's supposed to be dead in this scene, so it wouldn't really make sense that we would see this through Verso's perspective, unless there is a version of Verso that can actually see this transpiring. And perhaps there is a version of him. Perhaps if this is some kind of artwork inception, there's a version of him that finally got what he always wanted in the creation of this world, or at least the rewriting of events, and that would be that everybody has accepted that he's dead, Mael's alive, the family is perfect and happy now. I zeroed in on Verso itself being a clue into not only him being the reverse side of a painting, but also the reverse side of a page. I also want to take note of the Desandra family name. This could mean a couple of things. I actually would argue that it's perhaps a combination of two different things, and another indication, or at the very least a tick in the column of perhaps there's more to Verso and the idea of artwork inception. Desandre, if you were to just take that, in French, it's very similar to descending, which I think a lot of us can already see how that would be similar. We're seeing Verso descending into another world. If we think of these worlds as there being some kind of vertical component, then the Clea world, he has descended from that into the Lumiere world. However, it's also very similar to the word for ash in French, which is very similar to cinder. So if we kind of combine this together, it's descending into ashes. But the idea of descending into ashes makes sense if Verso existed within a writer's world. He descended, this time instead of Mael being the one to die within the fire, he descended into the ashes and he himself died in the fire instead. And that's where it was meant to end for him. However, we obviously see all the things that lead to the events within Expedition 33, which is Aline losing herself into the painted world of Lumiere. We also know that Verso was incredibly passionate about music, and in the same way that I had these ideas of Lune somehow becoming somebody who controls chroma, or at the very least creates these worlds through music because it's a form of writing, which seems like a callback to the writers, it made me wonder about the idea of Verso being somebody who really loves music, likely also perhaps wrote his own arrangements. And additionally, we actually see an interaction between him and Mael, where Mael asks him about writing poetry. It would seem that writing itself was something that was fairly significant to Verso as well.
No poetry lately.
I'm not really inspired these days.
One last thing to take note of within the names themselves, we've covered how Verso is not only the backside of a painting, but the backside of a page. We also have just now covered how the Desandra family name might have multiple meanings within it as well. But one last thing to take note of is that Renoir was a real French painter, and he was married to a woman named Aline. They were real people that existed within our own world, and their artwork has had lasting impressions, as it is part of the Impressionist movement of art. It's had lasting impressions, sorry for the bad pun, on the art world. And we see that they did have children. They had 3 children, but they are not the same names of the characters that we see within this video game, nor do they take on the same roles. They're not even the same genders. So it seems odd that you would have a French painter around the time that it seems like this world was influenced by. You have this French painter that existed named Renoir. You had his wife named Aline, and then nothing similar with their children. So I think there's this idea, perhaps hidden, there's a hidden meaning here, of the absence of anything to do with the children we see, that maybe it's not just these 3 worlds that I've laid out here, but there has been this concept of inception so many times that it has resulted in the matriarch and patriarch of the family remaining the same, but the children themselves have fluctuated and changed into different people altogether. And one last thing to mention, there is obviously a soul sliver that exists within Lumiere. We see it's a piece of the Versa that came from Clea's world. And when I was describing this potential perfect happy ending that Verso would have wanted, perhaps there is a soul sliver within this world as well of Verso. Perhaps there is a written soul sliver that exists, and that potential version of Verso is the one who is watching all this unfold, happy for once, because the thing that they had written into existence, the thing they wanted so badly for this world, actually came to fruition. Recapping everything we covered, a painting within a painting, the idea of this artwork inception and worlds within worlds, is something that I think is very feasible, and I almost borderline think that the writers are trying to clue you into based off of some of the evidence they've laid out. The other theory, I'm very aware, is very far-fetched, but it was just so fun to see how many instances of dialogue and hidden meanings within the names pointed in this direction. So while it was fun, and I think it's definitely great to explore these ideas, I by no means think that this is canon. I would love to know what are some of the things that I talked about that actually sparked a new theory for you, or what's something that within this you hadn't thought about before. Are you on board with these theories, or are you pretty against them? And if you're new and don't know, my main channel is dedicated to books. I absolutely love sinking my teeth into a story, especially when there are ones that have foreshadowing, trying to analyze how a writer or creator is laying out the groundwork for things to come, for big reveals, trying to piece things together, which has definitely made for Expedition 33 being something that I have really enjoyed. The entire ride of trying to figure out what was going on has been fantastic. All that said, I think there is so much more to come, and while that is sort of the book side of things that I like to analyze, I love doing that same thing for stories in all their other forms, which is what I do here on this channel, and Expedition 33 has been a treat. I do plan to make a lot more Expedition 33 content just because there is so much to dissect about this story, and I absolutely would love to know more of your thoughts on this game and the various theories that we'll go over. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.